up for that. Be sure and fulfill your commitment to be there. Others of you maybe didn't sign up but still would like to give. Just go down and check with them. They'd probably be able to fit you in. I will say this. Several have said, well, we were out of the country in the last year or so and they won't take our blood. Don't assume that. In fact, I talked to them and they said it varies. You know, it changes with time. Sometimes it's one country, sometimes it's another country. Just go by and ask them real quickly if you would like to give blood and are wondering about that, and they can let you know if they can take yours or not. I remember as a kid going through a period of time in which I was afraid to go to sleep at night because some kids at school had told me that if you dream that you die, that you will actually die. And it just terrified me. And I wasn't old enough to think through it, and so there was this adult in my life who said, how would anybody know that? And so that helped me get over my fear of that. You know, why we dream is still one of behavior science's greatest unanswered questions. My dreams, most of them I don't remember. And the ones I do remember are pretty insignificant and meaningless. But that's not true for everybody. I don't know how you feel about this, but there are a number of examples and I'm talking about scores of examples in recent years of people who have converted from Islam to Christianity. And do you know what they say their reason is? Because Jesus came to them in a dream. Now, do you want to just throw that out, or do you want to be thankful that they've come to Jesus? We got one person who's thankful that they came to Jesus. Thank you, Randy. But there's a number of people who have credited dreams for discoveries they've made. For instance, the number one song the song that has been recorded more than any other song is Yesterday. And Paul McCartney says that the melody to that song came to him in a dream. And he woke up the next morning and wrote it down. Do you know what he originally entitled that song? Scrambled Eggs. Now that would have, scrambled eggs. I mean, that just really would have gone a long way, wouldn't it? And Robert Louis Stevenson said that the book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, came to him in a dream. Well, so we're studying this guy Joseph, a.k.a. the dreamer. Last week, we took a look at the dysfunctional family of origin in which he was raised. And I wanted to give that background because it has a lot to do with the events that we're going to talk about this morning. So, turn with me, if you would, to Genesis chapter 37 and verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, as I pointed out last week, Joseph, and I'm going to do that several times in this sermon. Please try and help me. Try and think better than I think, because sometimes I say Jacob when I mean Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's favorite child. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, he is the son of Jacob's old age. Now, I don't know about your family, but our kids are spaced pretty close together, roughly 2 years in between each one of them. But when it came time for our younger son, Jonathan, as he was being raised, we raised him differently than we did, especially our daughter. We were much stricter with her than we were with him. In fact, there were a number of times as they were growing up that our older two would have eyes bugged out and mouths hanging open because they couldn't believe what our younger son was saying or doing and getting away with it. There's something about that younger son, especially as you get older. But second, he was the firstborn son of Rachel, and Rachel was Jacob's true love. Now, this favoritism didn't sit well with Joseph's brothers, and that shouldn't surprise us too much. In fact, verse 2 tells us that Joseph didn't help the cause either, as he was a snitch, okay? He was a tattletale. And so he's told on his brothers because of something that happened. We don't have the details of. But what really steamed them was this special robe. Imagine if you're the oldest sibling, and how many is an oldest sibling in your family? Oh, we've got quite a few. Well, think about this scenario. You turn 16 and your parents say, okay, if you want a car, you go out and earn it. You pay for it yourself. But then your younger sibling gets 16 and dad goes and gets them a brand new red Camaro. That wouldn't sit very well with you, would it? Now, my translation calls this robe ornate in verse 3. It's a Hebrew word that's hard to translate, but it goes deeper than just ornate. In fact, many biblical scholars say that it suggests that it was sleeved and that it was a long coat that went down to the ankles. Meaning, it wasn't intended for manual labor, okay? They didn't wear things like that when actual manual labor was being done. It was more like a garment for the overseer. It was more like a garment that should have been given to the eldest son. And Jacob never intended that robe to be a functional robe for Joseph. It was intended to be a symbol of his favored status. Now, the result is that they hated him. And in fact, verse 4 says that they could not speak a kind word about him. And so with things going so well between his brothers and him, Joseph decides, I'm going to tell them about my dreams. Joseph, what in the world possessed you to do that? Now, many scholars will tell you that Joseph did that because he's being prophetic and he's just telling his brothers about what's going to be the end result of things someday. You know what? It does not say anywhere in chapter 37 that Joseph was aware or that God had given him those dreams. That comes later to him as he reflects back. I think the only reason Joseph tells his brothers at this point what his dreams were is it's an in-your-face kind of thing. It's just rubbing it in again, I am the favorite. And so here they are. He says, here's my first dream. We're out in the field and we're gathering the sheaves and we bind them up and my sheaves stand straight up and your sheaves all bow down to me. And the brothers say, you actually think you're going to rule over us? And the result is they hated him even more. And so, since that works so well and the relations between them have improved to that point, he decides, let me tell you about another dream I had. In this dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars. Hey, these guys weren't the brightest guys on earth, but they picked up on the fact that the 11 stars were them. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Now, not only did that upset the brothers, that even upsets Jacob. Because Jacob knows in that dream he's the sun and his wife is the moon. And so he doesn't appreciate that at all. So, with things going so well now at this point between Joseph and his brothers, we read this, chapter 37, and beginning in verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Now, there's two questions I have. Man, we're losing people faster than a lot going on this morning. Two questions I have. Number one, what was Jacob thinking by sending Joseph to do that? And number two, was he thinking? Remember the bad report that Joseph had brought back in verse 2? I think maybe Jacob knew that Joseph would bring him any news of anything those brothers might be doing that they shouldn't. He's the snitch. And especially since they're going to that area called Shechem. You remember Shechem from last week? Shechem is the place where their sister had been raped, and so they had convinced the men of the town to be circumcised, and while they were still in their pain, these brothers go in and they kill all of them. And so Joseph sets out on this 2-day journey. But then he found out that his brothers had moved another day's journey away. And so he follows them there. And as he's coming to his brothers, this is when all that pent-up animosity just explodes. And so chapter 37 in verse 18 says, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.'" Now you remember Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn son. He was the eldest son. And Reuben had been the one who had slept with his father's concubine. Remember, he had slept with his half-brother's mother. But since he's the eldest, he might feel some sense of responsibility. And so in verse 21, it says, "When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father." So Reuben says, let's just teach Joseph a lesson. Let's don't kill him. Now verse 23 says, "So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal." I want you to notice several things that have happened here. When Joseph comes to him, what's the first thing they did to him? They took his robe. They took that symbol away from him, that symbol of favoritism. Then they threw him into a cistern. Thank goodness it didn't have any water in it. But they threw him into the cistern, and then what'd they do? They sat down to eat. There's no guilt. That shouldn't surprise us. I mean, these guys are cold-blooded murderers. Now, can you imagine what Joseph must have felt like as he was in the bottom of that cistern? I bet he was asking himself questions like, is my life over at the age of 17? And I bet he tried to climb out of it, but there was no way to get out. And he was screaming, but nobody was listening to him. How do I know he was screaming? Because years later, the brothers say this in Genesis chapter 42 and verse 21. 22 years later, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." And so verse 25 says they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Ishmaelites. Little lesson about Joseph's family tree. His grandfather's name was what? Isaac. Who was Isaac's brother? Ishmael. So these guys that come in this caravan are actually the descendants of his great uncle. And so they come on the scene. And so Judah, one of the older brothers, quickly comes up with this plan. Reuben must have stepped out for a moment. Judah says in verse 26, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. It's as if Judah says, Reuben's right. There's no reason for us to kill Joseph and have his blood on our hands. Hey, let's sell him and make some money off of it. And you know what? That takes care of our problem too, because it'll be good riddance. We'll never see him again. Now, what would you have done if you had been Joseph at this point? Would you have given up? Oftentimes for us, when we face adverse situations, that is at least the temptation, isn't it? To give up. When trials come, it just seems natural to cry out, "Why me?" Which is interesting, because when good things come our way, we don't usually cry out, "Why me?" And so Joseph learned some significant lessons during this time of adversity. The first thing he learned is that God cares and is in control. Now, here's where it gets a little bit sticky, because you've got Calvinists on one side, and there's all degree of Calvinists, and then you've got most of us, at least would be more Armenian in our thought, which is different from Calvinism. But Calvinists would claim here that God caused all of this to happen, that he caused his brothers to sell him into slavery in Egypt. I don't know about that. I don't like taking the position of trying to pretend like I know what God was doing or thinking, unless he tells me that's what he was doing or thinking. And many scholars, though, would tell you that. I prefer to believe that God has an overarching plan, and he's going to see that his overarching plan is accomplished. And even if there's detours in that, even if people come in and try to distort that, God's still going to get to his end point. And God's in control even when things don't seem to fit. But whether God causes evil men to do evil things to bring about his plan, I don't know about that. I do know this. In Acts chapter 7 and verse 9, as Stephen is preaching to the Sanhedrin, a very powerful lesson, and he goes through a lot of Old Testament history. And he says this: because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him. And I believe that. And I believe Hebrews chapter 13 and verses 5 and 6, it says, God has said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." So we say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" And I believe Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." Let me tell you what that verse doesn't say. It doesn't say what many people interpret that verse to say. Paul doesn't say that all things are good. Paul doesn't say that all things will end up good. Paul doesn't say that God causes bad things to happen so that he can make something good come out of it. Rather, the whole context of this passage is suffering. And what Paul is saying in Romans 8:28 is when we suffer, God will redeem it. When we suffer, God will bring something good out of it. Why? To his glory. So I'm getting ready to say something to you that is about the hardest words that ever have come across my lips. I can even see Romans 8:28 in my daughter's death. I can see that there have been some good things that have come out of it. Man, that's hard to say. But I know of people who've been brought back to the Lord. and are walking faithfully with Him because of it. I know I have become closer to the Lord through all of it. So there are some good things. I wouldn't trade it. That's obvious, right? And Paul tells us in verse 29 what that purpose is that God has for us. That purpose is that we be conformed to the image of His Son. That's the purpose, Romans 8:28. And so the summary of that might be that God hammers out the characteristics that He desires on the anvil of adversity. And that's what He does in the life of Joseph too. Second lesson Joseph learned. Joseph learned that even from the pit, God hears our call. Psalm 34 in verse 17 says, "The righteous cry out and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles." And so through these trials, Joseph gained a comforting sense of the presence of God. God doesn't always change our circumstances. God doesn't always work things out for us the way that we would like for Him to. But Joseph found out that the love of God is deep enough to hold on to us, and that He will never let us go. And Paul in Romans 8 finishes that chapter with these great verses. Verse 38, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Amen? And if you find yourself today in a difficult place in your life, I want you to just let those words wash over you. Now, for the next few minutes, I want to address something different, something else here, because there's a little side story within the major story. On the 5th anniversary of my daughter's death, back on February 22nd, in our Sunday afternoon together, I spoke from these verses. But there weren't many of you there, and I know that a number of people are in grief journeys right now. So I want to share this again. It's going to be a repeat for some of you, but it was after lunch that day, and probably most of you were asleep anyway, so that doesn't matter. I'm kidding. I hope I'm kidding. So chapter 37 and verse 31 says, "Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, 'We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe.' He recognized it and said, 'It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animals devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces.' Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days." I'm sorry, I said Joseph there. "Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. 'No,' he said, 'I'll continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave.' So his father wept for him." I want to share with you some observations about grief that I pull from this passage. And I give credit to a friend of mine named John Dobbs, who preaches in Monroe, Louisiana, and had a son who was killed in a traffic accident about a year or two before our daughter died. And he pointed out several things in this passage that I think are obvious. Number one, grief disrupts life. In verse 34, it says, "Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son." How long? For many days. The loss of someone we love leaves an empty place that knocks our legs out from under us and knocks our lives out of balance. And we react to that in differing ways. We react to that in significant ways that demonstrate how much we hurt. Jacob, it says, tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. That was the custom of that day. Today, sometimes people wear black. But beyond that, there's other things that we do to symbolize our hurt. Some people stop eating. Some people overeat. Some people can't sleep. Some people, that's all they want to do is sleep. There's all kinds of responses we have to grief. And when we experience loss, my point is it just disrupts the normal patterns of our lives. Secondly, grief affects our family and our friends. Verse 35 says, all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. If you have ever tried to comfort someone who is in the midst of raw grief, you know how hard it is to come up with words, don't you? So I'm going to let you off the hook a little bit this morning. There is nothing that you are going to be able to say to them that's going to take care of everything. There's nothing that's going to make it right. Nothing you can say. When that person's grief continues for weeks or even months without them getting back to normal or getting over it, there's a temptation on our part to want to withdraw from that person because that's the easiest thing to do. Rather than press into a hurting relationship, it's easier just to withdraw from it. And after Jenny's death, we actually had some people that pulled away from us. I don't know if they thought that what we had was contagious or just what. And some expressed the idea of, we'll be glad when y'all get back to normal. Well, can I tell you, the reality is, after a tragic loss like that, you have a new normal. There's no old normal. It's a new normal. So let me help you here. The truth is, again, there are no magic words. So save those Pollyannish cliches, most of which aren't true, about God picked a beautiful flower for his garden. Save all those things. Don't try to tell them what God did because you don't know what God did in that situation. Don't try to play God. In fact, sometimes to try to put the blame on God might cause that person to leave God. Simply say something like, I love you. I'm going to walk with you through it. I'm here. Practice presence. I believe in the ministry of presence. Maybe words are never spoken, but just that they know you're there with them. That means a lot. I would encourage you also, and this is one I'm going to work harder on. It's way too easy just to say, if you need something, call me. Can I tell you, when a person's in the midst of raw grief, they don't have the energy to call you? Okay? And if they're grieving, they probably don't have the energy to cook. They don't have the energy to remember a recipe. And maybe their yard's needing mowed, maybe their house needs cleaned. Just think ahead and do those things that you would want someone to do for you if you were in grief. Here's the truth. Those in grief really don't want to stop hurting for a while. Their pain is the direct result of the depths of love they felt for somebody. And grieving hard is oftentimes the result of loving hard. And to release that grief too quickly makes the griever think maybe that relationship, maybe I'm showing by my grief that relationship really wasn't all that important to me. Listen, understand this. Grieving hurts. It is like an open wound. Now, over time, that open wound begins to heal. I've got scars on my body that if I push on them, they still hurt a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? But it's nothing like it was when it was an open wound. And that's what happens with grief. It gets better over time, but there's still pain there. Which leads to number 3, grief lasts a lifetime. The last part of verse 35, Jacob said, no, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. When our daughter died, I thought the pain and exhaustion of grief was never going to stop. There were days that I got up with such a heaviness in my soul that I didn't know if I could continue. The rest of the world's just continuing to speed by, but for the griever, they can't enter into that. My daughter died nearly 5.5 years ago. The pain of that day is not the same as it is today. But I will tell you this, if I live to be 110, I will go to my grave as a grieving father. Fourth, grief brings tears. It says in verse 35, so his father wept for him. Now some people are uncomfortable around people when they're crying. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people come to my office or I'm just visiting with them and they want to apologize for their crying. Don't apologize for crying. That's a God-given thing. It's not weakness to cry. God designed us for that. In fact, let me share with you the brilliance of God. The tears of grief are different from other kinds of tears. The tears of grief have toxins in them because our system has gotten upset, because we're out of our normal routine, because our lives have been so upset. We have toxins that build up in our bodies and they are released through the tears of grief. Isn't God incredible? Let someone try to explain to you how that just happened by natural selection. And understand this, the tears that are cried at a funeral aren't the last tears of a grieving person. For the first couple of years, I found myself overwhelmed just over and over again. I mean, it was almost daily, just overwhelmed with tears of grief. It's gotten much further in between, but I don't know when it's coming. I'll be in my car driving down the road, and maybe a song comes on that just has a line in it, or maybe I remember something about Jenny through it, and I have to pull over and get through that before I can keep on driving. Well, finally, grief is acknowledged by God. In the Psalms, it says in Psalm 56 and verse 8, speaking to God, you keep track of all my sorrows, you've collected all my tears in your bottle, you have recorded each one in your book. That's beautiful, isn't it? It says God knows every tear you cry. But it helps if you know the backstory to this. In this ancient culture, particularly when a man was going off to war, he would give his wife what they called a tear vial. And while he was gone, she was to collect all of the tears that she cried over him being gone. And then she was to give it to him when he returned to let him know how much he was missed. And the psalmist is picking up on that and saying God is collecting every tear. He knows every one, and he takes it seriously. He acknowledges our grief. Now, sadly, all of the grief that Jacob experienced here was based on a lie. But he didn't know that for many years, and so even though it was based on a lie, it was truth for him. But not long before he died, Jacob actually got to see Joseph again. Can you imagine the elation he felt? Oh, what I would give for 30 minutes with my daughter again. But you know what it does? It makes me more grateful for the gospel. Because someday we can see our loved ones again. I don't know who came up with this theology that says that we're not going to know each other in heaven. That is such Greek philosophy that we're just some dismembered spirit floating around somewhere. I just don't see where anyone can come up with that. And I'm looking forward to the day when I'm reunited with those I love. That keeps me going. Someday I'm going to see her again, and someday all those wrongs are going to be made right, and all the diseases are going to be cured, and all the brokenness is going to be mended, and there will never, ever be a tear of grief ever again. Amen. So last week I had people who have experienced dysfunction in their family of origin or who have dysfunction in their lives. I'd ask them to stand, and I'd ask people that wanted to reset their priorities, whether it's as a parent or just in their priorities of seeking Jesus. And I asked them to stand, and you flowed to them. And I don't know if there was anyone sitting at the end of that service. I'm not going to do that again today, but I am going to do this. Today, I want to say to you, if you are walking through a journey of grief, Beverly and I are going to be standing right up here as soon as I finish and the invitation has begun. And if you want to come join us right here up front, then at the end of the invitation song, Craig Jordan's going to lead a prayer over those of us who are in a grief journey. If one of you wants to come up here and stand with someone you know that's in that journey, that's fine too. But as we stand, if you need to go and visit with an elder and his wife, go to room 102. But as we stand, and if you want to come and be prayed over, we would encourage you to do that right now. Let's stand together and sing.
Blessed be your name in a land.